So thank you for coming. I've got my back to you. I feel a bit rude. Apologies for that. So this is an event that we have put on as part of a project that Leicester Comedy Festival are running called A Funny City, which is looking at the relationship between comedy and the city since 1979. The reason 1979 has been picked is because that was the year, as far as we can tell, that the phrase alternative comedy was coined nationally. So the project, which was launched a few weeks ago, is looking at the growth of comedy and the link between the city and comedy, and part of that is around archiving and documenting some of the archive materials that the festival has built up since it started in 1994. The project is funded by Heritage Lottery Fund, and this conversation will go online and will become part of that archive. So thank you for coming, and I suppose the first thing to do is introduce the panel. So do you just want to introduce yourselves, just very briefly, just say who you are and where you're from?
Hello, I'm Rob G. I grew up in Derby. I now live in Leicester, have done for a long time, and I'm a performance poet.
And I'm Kev F. I was born in Aberdeen and I live near Bristol, so what the hell am I doing here? Lived in Leicester for a long time, was brought up in Kibworth and ran comedy clubs here in the 80s.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, my turn. I'm Elaine Pantling and I'm from Leicester. I'm a comedy actress and writer, and I've never lived anywhere else. This is it.
Hi, I'm Matt Hollins. I'm a stand-up comedian. I've been doing comedy since 2003. From Cancersthorpe originally, now live in Blaby.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was from Blaby. I was brought up in Blaby. There you go.
Yeah,
That's it.
Maybe
Sorry.
we can discuss that later.
Absolutely.
That's the next
Yeah.
project, is a
Okay.
history of Blaby. But, my name's Jeff. I'm the founder and director of Leicester Comedy Festival. So what I thought we'd do first of all is just to get a flavour of what comedy in the city was like before the Comedy Festival started in 1994. And I have to confess, looking at Rob and Kev, I don't think we know which came first, if you'd excuse the phrase.
I came before Rob, because I am older.
You did, okay.
However, I look up to him because he's about 8 feet tall. We started running a comedy club, or rather started participating in a comedy club that somebody else was running in 1984. Can you top that, Rob?
No, it's way before me. I moved to Leicester in 91 to do nurse training.
Okay.
And then I started doing poetry in 93. And then I've got a letter from you, Jeff, from the start of 94 going, thanks for getting in touch, don't ever bother me again. Or words very diplomatic phrase to that effect.
Thank goodness you ignored it.
Absolutely.
So, Kev, can you just talk to us a little bit, and I think we've got about an hour or so. So briefly, where was the club that you ran? You were in Leicester. Where did the idea of setting up a comedy club come from?
The thing is, there already was a comedy club, so as for the absolute genesis, I can't swear, but the magazine Joke Space had already opened when we discovered it in 1984. It was being run by the great Alphonse and the handsome Herbert, whose real names I would love to be able to tell you, but I think I've forgotten. I believe the handsome Herbert was Adrian Beale.
Okay.
And they were actors based at the Phoenix Theatre, which of course was on Newark Street.
And the magazine was the magazine pub?
The magazine was the magazine pub, yes. Not the magazine military museum, which at that point was on a traffic island. It was in part of its 40 years on a traffic island. No, just up the road was the magazine pub, which was subsequently demolished in the 1990s. But in the upstairs room of the magazine pub, they started a comedy club probably in 1984, maybe at the end of 83. Really don't know.
Okay.
And it was called the magazine Joke Space because next door, does anybody know what was next door? was called the Magazine Workspace. A very 1970s name for this sort of... You rented out workshops. The Poetry Secretariat were based at the Magazine Workspace, and various collectives and sort of... We'd call them startups now. Then they were other small businesses, and it was Workspace. So the Joke Space was a play on that.
Okay.
And that ran for a few years. Then somebody else took it over and called it Wits End, which is what the comedy club was called for one season. And then in 1987, Alan Seaman, who couldn't be with us today, unfortunately, he was the person who booked the acts for a comedy club that we called the Monk House. And the Monk House, which had a picture of Bob Monkhouse on the masthead, was run by Alan and I. Alan booked the acts, I did the designs and the promotions, I did the posters, and photocopied and enlarged Bob Monkhouse's face from a 1950s ad for Mars bars that I found in an old Eagle comic. And the Monkhouse Comedy Club ran from 87 until I left Leicester, and it kept going for a little while after that, ending about 1991.
And this was a weekly club, a monthly? Monthly. Okay.
Monthly comedy club.
Okay.
One of the things, I've actually put a blog up called My 1970s Diary, as part of which, extending into the 80s, I've actually found the posters for these clubs. So you can actually see these online. They're on. If you go to Twitter, My 1970s Diary, you'll find the Monkhouse posters. It includes what may be the first regional comic relief gig, which was this week in 1988. For all I know, I haven't seen any others, but in 1988, which was the first televised comic relief, we did one, which was headlined by Lindsay Moran. No, me neither. But I did know who Lindsay Moran was in 1988, and we'd rebooked him because he'd done the second night in 1987, and had been the most sensational act we'd seen. He wore a tutu and played an accordion. He wore glasses and was Scottish. What could go wrong? It was absolutely the funniest thing you'd ever seen. He retired from comedy not very long afterwards, when it turned out TV wasn't looking for that. And he is now an artist who has his own studio up in the wilds of Scotland. So, but anyway, Lindsay Moran, Comic Relief, 1988.
And what prompted you? Because one of the things that we've kind of found by doing the project so far is that, unlike some other cities, Leicester didn't traditionally have a strong live comedy tradition. There was a lot of working men's clubs comedy, but there wasn't, unlike perhaps Liverpool, for example, or Glasgow, which are known for their comedy. Leicester less so, I think.
Now, isn't that interesting? Because my memory, obviously because I was based here as a teenager, was that it had a strong comedy scene, but that it was that old-fashioned comedy scene.
Yes.
There were lots of working men's clubs and big clubs as well. One which was near us, like I say, my family live in Kibworth, and Kibworth Lodge was a club which hosted jazz a couple of nights a week, and had pictures on the wall including Paul Daniels and Roger de Courcy and Nookie Bear. Acts of that quality, or standard, or level, acts who were big acts on the telly in the 1960s and 1970s, would play in places like the Lodge and all over Leicestershire, and especially in the working men's clubs of Leicester and the Midlands. And I think we were very strong for that. So there was that tradition. Alternative comedy, of course, was kicking against that tradition, and that's what we were part of.
So what prompted you and Alan to set it up?
Well,
you'd seen some comedy elsewhere, you'd been to clubs elsewhere?
We were doing a radio show. Radio Leicester had for a long time a show called Prime Time, which was the youth access show, and we qualified as youth at that time. And so we went along, and you got lots of students, graduate types like ourselves, and we would go along, and in Alan and my case, we would do funny things. Other people went on to be trainee journalists. A guy called Silly Brian, we used to call him. He used to be really passionate about sports, and he just wanted to talk about sports all the time, and we just called him Silly Brian because that was the most pathetic thing we could think of. He's now Ian Carter, the leading sports journalist on BBC Radio 4. And has been for the last 25 years. Anyway, that's what everyone else was doing, but Alan and I were doing silly comedy sketches, and we were trying to be radioactive and all the other radio programmes of the day. And we would hear stand-up comedians on the radio, and some people had started to appear on the telly. Obviously, the young ones had been on the telly, and there'd been lots of stand-up showcases like that. It was just before, or at the time of Saturday Live and Friday Live. So
Yeah.
Ben Elton, Harry Enfield, and the like were breaking through. So the stand-up we were aware of. I'm not entirely sure if we had seen a professional stand-up comedy gig before we started putting on stand-up comedy gigs.
Yeah.
And quite where Alan found the comedians from, I'm not sure. But the first night was headlined by Hattie Hayridge, and she played for £25.
Right. Blimey. And was that a success? That
No,
first gig?
absolute washout.
Right. Okay.
Nobody came. The first night was the only night we took out an advert in the Leicester Mercury. I can't remember what that cost, actually. Oh, I wish I knew. Alan would know. We took out the ad in the Leicester Mercury. I put the posters up. I made the flyers. We did everything that we thought you needed to do. I had seen stand-up comedy by then because I'd been to the Edinburgh Fringe for a number of years by then. So, of course, by 1987, we had seen tons of stand-up comedy. Of course we had. And we were starting to perform stand-up comedy in other places. Well, London.
Okay.
London, and on folk club and variety club bills.
Yeah.
It was quite rare, actually, for a thing to be a night of comedy, whereas it was not unusual to be a comedian in between musical acts
Yeah.
and other novelties. And so the acts who were in town already when we started, or when the magazine Joke Space started in 1984, remember we started the Mughouse in 87, included Arnold Bolt, who died last year, very sadly. But Arnold Bolt was a folk club from the folk circuit, which again was very well established and very, very strong in the Midlands.
Yeah.
The most famous Midland act being Jasper Carrott from Nottingham. And the folk club grew the folk comedians like Billy Connolly, Jasper Carrott, Max Boyce and others, who basically would talk in between the musical numbers. And then when they became most known as comedians, they would perform comedy in between musical numbers. Looking at the lineup, which I did earlier this week, for our comic relief gig in 1988, apart from Lindsay Moran doing his comedy, and Alan and I doing our stand-up emceeing, everybody else were musical acts, folky musical acts, because they were the only other people who'd play for free.
And that kind of leads us on, I think, although you'll correct me if I'm wrong, Rob, to your kind of origins as a performer,
Yeah.
because you, am I right in saying that you kind of came out of that sort of, maybe not folk, but kind of punk, kind of folky type scene, and performing in that kind of environment?
Because for me, because I grew up on punk rock, which would have, I think, eventually led to me doing performance poetry. But it's funny, I spent ages trying to sort of dallying with the comedy circuit, and then ages avoiding it, and then 5 years doing it professionally, and then the rest of the time avoiding it again. But when I moved to Leicester in '91, I was doing a lot of, as Kev says. I mean, so I suppose we sort of crossed over. You would have gone at the point I was arriving, and yeah, I was basically, I'd started writing and performing poetry, and it was funny for the most part, and I was basically going anywhere that would have me. Which for the most part was acoustic sort of gigs. And all roads led to the magazine on Newark Street, which was a unique anti-fascist theme pub, really. It was unique. That Dave and Hazza used to run it. Their whole thing, I remember the thing about the magazine, the condoms are in jars at the bar rather than in toilets, because Dave didn't see any reason they should be in toilets. And there were a lot of things about the magazine which were quite... But that was the atmosphere in which I started performing poetry, and it was... and there was a lot of mentorship as well from very seasoned... Because a lot of sort of folk and acoustic performers are actually... You know, they'd built the patter on stage, so as Kev says, you know, there's a lot of crossover between the sort of chatting with crowds and making them laugh and actually doing more formal sort of stand-up. And then... I suppose in the mid-late 90s, I was performing poetry on, I mean, it's never healthy, it's never really a circuit, it's sort of like a grubby underbelly of comedy is performance poetry, but there's pockets of it. And so I was performing it around the UK, and I set up a club called The Bright Side, which was basically a performance poetry gig, but it was a comedy club format. And I think what happened in Leicester over, as far as I could see, over the late as the late 90s happened was that Jongleurs came here in 99, largely I think on the back of the work done by then by a comedy festival, and then everything sort of went up a notch. And Brightside, the club then, did great on the back of all that, because it was everything that wasn't, but its presence there was very good for us, because it sort of illustrated a different kind of night out once we'd established that Leicester audiences liked going out to hear people talk.
Yeah. So did you not perform as a comedian because you wanted to do poetry, or did you not perform as a comedian because there wasn't anywhere to gig locally as a comedian?
I wasn't funny enough to be a comedian.
You were funny enough to be a comedian.
The main
so you
thing
wanted to be a poet?
No, I never wanted to be. I don't know what I wanted to. It was weird, because I used to sing in punk rock bands, and all it was, I read some lyrics out in a pub, and someone booked me for a poetry gig, and so it was never an an intended thing. And I did, because everyone was laughing at it. When I was about 20, 21, I was trying a lot of the comedy, the unpaid spots at the clubs, and I remember I got booed off in Nottingham and missed the last train home. Slept under that, the stairway in Nottingham Station, sort of kept, and 2 policemen followed me in there at 2 in the morning, and one of them goes, "Well, you can stay here, but don't make any noise," which I thought was quite beautiful. And so I thought, no, that's not for me, But then we did set up Brightside, which ran very successfully for 7 years, really. And it was a comedy club format. And by then, I think there were quite a few independent comedy clubs around Leicester. By then, you've got clubs like Ship of Fools and whatnot that were already, quite established.
Which Alan Seaman.
Well, exactly.
Yeah. All roads point back to Alan, don't they?
He went from Monkhouse to Ship of Fools.
Yeah,
Interestingly, mentioning poetry, there was funding for poets. So at the Monkhouse and the magazine Joke Space before it, we would have regular appearances by poets, because there was funding from the Poetry Secretariat next door. Because poetry was art or culture.
That's right.
And comedy wasn't. There wouldn't be funding for comedy.
Would be well to remember that.
Rightly so, I think. But there was funding for poetry. And Henry Normal was perhaps the highest profile of the comedians that we had. Henry Normal, who went on to found Baby Cow Productions with Steve Coogan.
And has recently given that up and become a poet full-time again and his tour.
I was actually unaware of that.
He did it, I think, last year. But and in the early 90s, certainly from a comedy festival point of view, there was a club which I think started at the Y, called And Why Not, which Nicola Ward promoted, and then she moved to what was Bar Gaudi, now is Mosh, the club, and St Nicholas Circle, is it called? Anyway, whatever it's called. So in the early 90s there was And Why Not, and certainly Nicola promoted regular nights, some with big names, Phil Jupitus and others, who was touring around that time, who was also Porky the Poet. Probably so he could get some funding, I imagine, for that. But in terms of Kev, you were talking earlier on about who to book, and that was Alan's kind of world. But did people start to approach you to perform at Monkhouse? Or
word got
spread?
about. But Alan took responsibility for that, and so the acts that we had, which included people like Patrick Marber, Kevin Day, Mark Lamar, Linda Smith, who was on the double bill that night with Henry Normal. I remember seeing the poster recently. Frank Skinner, who brought a package from the comedy club he was running in Tamworth at the time. So he actually brought, I think, 4 or 5 acts, and they made up the entire night, and also brought an audience with them, which was fantastic. I'm assuming we made them pay.
And do you think there was between the two of you? Was there crossover in terms of audiences? Because a lot of this was at the magazine.
Yes.
We wanted each other's radar till Edinburgh.
There was a crossover. People who went out to things went out to other things.
Yeah.
And that one tends to find. But certainly we had a pretty good, regular and faithful, apart from the very first night of the Monkhouse, which was really a washout. Once we stopped advertising in the Mercury, people started coming, so we got that sorted. And yes, we would have these large, healthy audiences who would subsequently be found going out to just drink at the Bricklayers, which was a good place to bump into our crowd when it wasn't our night.
And were both of you aware of the sort of the growth, I suppose, nationally, of comedy in terms of both of sort of times when you were doing what you were doing, did you become aware, Kev, that your club was there was a growing network nationally of clubs?
It was hard to know much about clubs in other cities because in the days before the internet, you had to get these things from word of mouth or until they made the national press. But you'd know from other comedians and from the opportunity to play places. So Alan and I, by 1987, had started performing. He was performing under the name, oh God, what was the name of the accountant? Oh God, he did the name of he did an entire character act. The surname must have been Boring, but I've forgotten it. Anyway, he pretended to be this accountant, and I pretended to be PC Beharsted and wore a policeman's outfit and sang songs. And given the fact that I can neither play the guitar nor sing, it was an ill-advised career move. But we played, amongst other places, Norwich Arts Centre in a double bill of the accountant whose name I can't remember, and PC Bastard. Somebody booked that, God help them. There wasn't a comedy club, they just booked the two of us.
So
took what came.
But the growth of, let's call it alternative comedy,
so
you were aware that you were part of something bigger?
We were aware that London had Time Out and clubs that you could get gigs at, and we would play at places like Eugene Cheese ran a comedy club called the Cheese Shop on Denmark Street. I remember being on the bill with Mark Lamar on that, and that would probably be where the Mark Lamar booking then came from. And it would be going down to London and being on the bill with people, which is probably where a lot of our acts came from. As for the rest of the country, apart from the occasional thing like that Norwich one I described, no, it would be the stuff of myth and legend, and probably still a grey area what was happening in the rest of the country. The Edinburgh Fringe, as I say, we had visited, but that was the exception.
And so presumably the dominant city for comedy at the time was London.
Totally.
If you were going to make it, you would move from wherever you were in the country to London, and that's where you would
or travel down in order to perform at these clubs. Jongleurs and the Banana Cabaret and a few others which still exist to this day were just starting up. The Comedy Store, I remember going to see Paul Merton at the Comedy Store around that time. They were coming into being, but the circuit as we know it didn't exist. Indeed, comedy in Time Out was listed as alternative cabaret, certainly up to and including 1988. I don't know when it changed to being a separate listing for comedy, but by 88 it was still alternative cabaret. And so we were called the Monk House, the Alternative Comedy Club. You really had to make that clear, because comedy clubs still meant Bowtie and Bernard Manning in 1988 in Leicester to most people.
So Elaine, if I can just bring you in, I think from your introductions, you and Matt have been in Leicester the longest. Yeah. Were you aware of that kind of working men's club, if we'll call it that for the time being, scene growing up in Leicester? I mean, were you aware of let's call it traditional comedy growing up? Because Kev was talking about it being very strong. You were aware of that? Yeah, definitely. The working men's club, we used to go as a family. We go to Crofts Club and to Lutterworth Club as well, and we'd watch the Minter or Shawaddy Waddy would be on. And and there'd be a comedy act on, which I don't think really I took much notice of that, to be honest. But because we were there for the music and the bingo, I guess it's that sort of thing. But it's interesting. I do remember seeing it. I can't even remember what this comedian was called, but I'll never forget it. And it was an old guy singing Mule Train, and he was banging a tray on his head, and that's always stayed with me because I just thought it was totally hilarious. But I mean, I remember because I used to go out with somebody that did the clubs. He was a magician, and he did disappear just like that. Just had to get that in. But we used to go to a lot of the clubs around the country, and he would be the sort of comedy act. And I remember him. He was support act for Lenny Henry. And that was, and that's, Lenny he'd won New Faces, I think. So when was this?
Oh gosh, that would be in the 70s. So I left school in 75, So it's probably be about 76, 77, something like that maybe.
Okay.
And yeah, I used to go and watch a lot of the acts around the country really, and actually the real funny people were the people introducing the acts. The what did they call them when they stood? Interlocutor. Oh, that's a good name. No, I don't think it was called that. You know, like when they did the wheel tappers and shunters. So it's all a bit like that, you know, and then, you know, yeah.
It's compare or MC,
yeah,
same as we
MC,
said now,
yeah,
sure.
yeah.
And
wheel tappers and shunters, that was one for the kids.
And what about kind of in the 80s when Kevin Allen started to do their thing and the alternative comedy, being in Leicester at the time, were you aware? I'm not asking you whether you went to Kevin Allen's club, but were you aware then of the growth of alternative comedy, I guess, in the 80s in Leicester?
Not in Leicester. I think, you know, on the television, yeah, you know, watching it on the the young ones and stuff like that, which my mum thought was absolutely disgraceful. But we just absolutely loved it, and so did my dad as well. I'll never forget that bit with the Tampax and the mouse thing, and you know, my mum just walking out of the room and going, switch it off, and my dad going, leave it on. But you know, so I wasn't really aware of, you know, the actual comedy club scene.
So I'm interested in your career as a performer, because we were talking earlier on about the growth of alternative comedy, let's call it that, and then the sort of cabaret, variety, maybe more of Rob's world, which was performance poetry and all of that kind of world, which was happening at the same time. And would you describe yourself as an actress, as a performer? Because I certainly know that you've done stuff which I would describe as being more cabaret type stuff. When did you start that, and did you start that because you were inspired by this whole emerging comedy thing, or was it completely separate to that?
I think that I I actually really wanted to be a serious actress. That's absolutely, right. You know, so my first, after going to university, because I was a late starter, so I didn't actually get my degree until I was 40. So I did a performing arts degree, well, it was single honours theatre degree. So I thought that I was going to be this serious actress. So when I sort of made my first piece and people started to laugh at it, I was a little bit surprised. So,
and maybe disappointed?
I don't know, but it's that sort of thing that what you do, you kind of... I remember one of my lecturers saying to me, but Elaine, you've just got funny bones. And I'm thinking, well, are you going to give me 100% mark for that, or am I just going to get a pass? But it's that thing about... I think I kind of stumbled across it, because I guess that naturally there's that sort of clown within me. Mm-hmm. And I think that some of the people that I really like sort of steer me towards that kind of, I guess, variety. I love that whole kind of sense of variety performance, like Beryl Reid and Victoria Wood. You know, so as a woman, for me, it's important to kind of aspire to those performers. So.
And how did you find places to gig in Leicester then? Because a minute ago you said you weren't aware of this kind of emerging comedy scene. You're not, I think I'm right in saying you're not a stand-up comedian.
No, although I've dabbled.
Yes.
Oh my gosh, it's so hard.
So how did you find, a similar sort of question to what I was asking Rob and Kev earlier on about, how did you find the venues to book you, and also how did you find an audience for what you were doing?
I guess that I know that a lot of my work has come through the being involved in the comedy festival, but it's that whole thing about networking. You know, you start to get to know people, and I think my first sort of it was at when I was at university. So I performed at the Phoenix and at the Y Theatre as well, and sort of got myself in that, with moving around those circles. But as far as the comedy festival is concerned, I think the first time I actually performed in the comedy festival, I think it was 2001. think, with Gusset.
Mm-hmm.
And that was I was on the show at the Haymarket, and which was really scary, with all those comedians at the back throwing sandwiches and stuff at each other and swigging beer.
So who was on that gig?
Lee Mack, he was the compere. There was loads. Daniel Kitson, whom I absolutely adore. I think he's a really clever comedian and writer, storyteller. There was a lot. Oh dear, that's terrible. Mr. Pun himself.
Tim Vine.
Tim Vine, he was on.
I think Milton was on that
Jones
night
was
as well.
on, yeah.
And you mentioned the Y and the Phoenix.
Yeah.
Any specific people at those venues who were important, like behind the scenes in terms of support and booking?
Obviously Wendy Green, it was at the time, Wendy Clues. She was great, and she was really supportive of,
And she
of
was
my
at-
work. She was at the Y.
The Y.
And Judy Hughes, she was the programmer at the Phoenix, and she was really important to me. But I mean, so they're those sort of people believed in the work that I was doing, and I remember you getting me to do a working men's club. Do you remember that, Braunston, Victoria?
I
My
think I do,
gosh.
yeah.
Oh,
I'm surprised you're still talking to me.
yeah. and it was, you said it would be a really good idea. You know, I remember having the meeting with the concert secretary and sat there, and oh my gosh, the words that came out of his mouth. But anyway, it was just incredible. And that was a very scary thing. But I got an amazing write-up in the Mercury for that. I can't believe that I did. So yeah, there's a few things that you've got me to do that I probably should never forgive you for.
That's unlikely to change, but
Yeah.
you're all probably in there.
Yeah.
Let's move on.
Yeah.
Let's move on. And so then bringing us more recently up to date, Matt, when did you start stand-up?
I started by doing a workshop run by Anthony King, a local comedian. That was spring 2003, and I did my first gigs in the summer of
Right.
that year. Yeah.
And you wanted to do that because you'd seen other people perform in Leicester or nationally?
No.
Or?
I didn't really go out to watch stand-up comedy very often, to be honest. I'd always made people laugh at school and stuff, but I never had a big interest in going out to watch comedy. And I had thought about trying it years earlier, but it just, I've not got friends or family involved in it. It seemed a bit fanciful, and I mentioned it to one or two people, and they didn't think I'd be any good at it. And as soon as I saw it advertised in the Mercury, this workshop, and I thought, oh yeah, that's what I want to do. So I found a pal in Seaman, I think actually it was. And got booked in, and that was great. Yeah. And so that was the first time I performed on a stage in front of other people in the workshop.
And you were aware of the festival in Leicester at that point?
I was aware. My dad used to encourage me to go and watch stuff at the festival, but I never did. Because me and my mates, we just used to go out drinking or whatever. And no one really mentioned the festival.
So you saw the advert in the Mercury, you went along to the workshop, and presumably it went all right, and you thought, I could do this.
I booked into a competition, So You Think You're Funny. My first ever gig was the Heat in London, and that went well, but I didn't get through. It's probably a bit unwise to do it as my first gig. But it was nice because I performed in front of 100 strangers for my first gig and made them laugh, so I think that was a nice memory, yeah.
I don't think you could do that. I don't think you could do your first gig as part of So You Think You're Funny now. I think
possibly not.
Gigged around a bit more than that.
Yeah, the competitions have changed a bit now. Yeah, they want a bit more experience, I think.
And gigs that you were doing in Leicester at that point, where would you? I mean, we've mentioned the magazine, we've mentioned the Y, we've mentioned the Phoenix, we've mentioned various clubs. What was important at that point to you in 2003?
Well, the workshop was at the Ship of Falls, at the Looking Glass where the Ship of Falls is, so that's where I started out. We did a showcase at the Ship of Falls, that was my second gig, and I did there a few times, well, a lot early on, yeah.
Anywhere else in Leicester at the time?
I've been trying to think actually. I'll have them written down at home, but Spiky Mike's started one, a guy from Nottingham at the Charlotte. You had bands playing downstairs, so there was the noise coming into the room, so it wasn't ideal. he actually does run really good clubs now over the Midlands. There wasn't many regular ones that I can think of off the top of my head. No.
And then, so you started at a workshop. Your very first gig was So You Think You're Funny, and then in 2004, you're, I think I'm right in saying, one of only 2 people who won from Leicester, who won the Leicester Mercury Comedian of the Year.
Yeah.
Can you just tell us about that a little bit? Who was on? What was that like?
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, Russell Kane, I knew. I looked at the other acts and I did a bit of research and I thought Russell Kane looks like his stiff competition.
Because you did that research on the internet. We had the internet at this
We
point.
had the internet then, yeah. So, and I'd gig with one of the other acts. I shouldn't say really, I didn't think they were very good, so I thought I'll be better than them. And who was on? There was a guy from Chris Roach from Oldham. I'm not sure if he's gigging now. He was a good act. And Matt Reed and Farron, they were double act. Matt Reed is doing really well as a solo act now. And so yeah, a guy from Australia, Matt Dictinska. And
Who hosted it? I can't even remember who.
it
hosted
was Michael Legg.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you won that still pretty early on in your career. You'd only been gigging for maybe a year or less.
Less. Yeah, it's my 25th gig. Yeah.
Good grief. And then you were a gigging Leicester comedian.
Yeah.
What was that like once you'd won the competition? Because again, earlier on, Kev was talking about the importance of London, certainly, and all of that. What was it like being based in Leicester, being a Leicester comedian, and trying to develop your career, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, for a few years, because I've got records of my gig, I was doing more in London than I was in Leicester. I was on the National Express all the time, or the train down to London, and because I got that competition behind me, I could get onto some good bills, and then I got an agent not long after, and was with her for 4 years, and so, yeah, went up to Manchester quite a lot, and yeah, it's good. It's tough though. It's ruthless business. Yeah.
Do you think Leicester audiences have? I mean, this is maybe a question for all of you because you still are all gigging in Leicester, some more than others. But do you think Leicester audiences, Matt, have changed over the time you've been doing stand-up? Which is I don't know, maybe nearly 15 years. Do you think it's changed a lot?
No, I wouldn't say that. No.
What about the others? Do you think?
I
think so?
I think I know the type of gigs I do have changed, but I think that's more about me than audiences, to be honest. In terms of what audiences go for, I don't think that's particularly changed. But I don't know if that's what you're asking. Is it more about sort of demographics of audiences, or where they?
Yeah, and then I was going to come on to sort of subject matters, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I've not
topics.
noticed. There must have been sort of evolutions. I've genuinely not noticed any great, you know.
And the thing that I'm not doing is not playing in a little club like the Monkhouse. So what clubs there are like the Monkhouse, which could only fit 50 people in, and that's the same as the punk gigs. And when you're gigging with bands, when you're doing something that's new and refreshing, as opposed to those 1970s bow-tied comedians, they were always playing in big, packed working men's clubs, a guaranteed captive audience, and that was also, of course, dying out come the 80s anyway. But our alternative comedy clubs, I just did inverted commas with the fingers, listeners. Those alternative comedy clubs, they were also alternative in that you couldn't generate so much money, and they were rooms of 50 people at the most. Now, if that's going on now, because I don't play in the little 50-seater rooms, and when we do play in places, I'm one of those many acts who does 2 nights at the Leicester Comedy Festival, because that's as many as you can sell out. At the Kyle, which I think holds 80, and a lot of us can do that sort of thing. So I see bigger audiences, but I'd love to know that there are young burgeoning clubs doing something which is not quite ready for telly, which is more exciting and more new, and there's only 40 or 50 people willing to come and see it yet.
I think there's always going to be clubs like that. Certainly for what I know in the world of poetry, there's plenty around these parts as well. And my last involvement with the comedy circuit nationally and locally was up until the end of 2009 in a manufactured double act, and And yeah, it was really healthy. You know, one club would close and another one would start. And then I think one thing that was different from the sort of mid-90s onwards was that people would have more than one club. So you'd have something like, you know, you'd have Funhouse. You know, we'd have several clubs and that would mushroom. You'd got Bottle Rocket, which would start, say, one club in Firebug, and then I'll do one in Loughborough, I'll do one. And we'd done that with Brightside, where we'd run it in Leicester, and then we were simultaneously doing it in Derby and Nottingham, but it was the Leicester one that was carrying both. And I think that has been a difference, is that I suspect, 15, 20 years ago, people would run a club and it would be a labour of love. It would be a very grassrootsy sort of animal.
That's it.
And it will still be a grassrootsy sort of animal and a labour of love. But I think in terms of comedy specifically, I think people are more likely to run a few clubs with one brand name and then book an act that they'll get to do.
And I think
there's a lot more of that.
Those clubs that come under the banner or are in the inheritance of the alternative are very conventional. I mean, there is an established format to running a comedy club now. The old days that I was describing, where you would have musical acts, variety acts. We had a performance act. Again, they probably got funding, and once somebody sat at the top of a stepladder in a costume the shape of the globe and expounded on geopolitical matters, and then was followed by knob and bot gags. That's not what happens now. You get, well, if anybody's seen Mock the Week, that's where, you know, the chicken and egg situation arises. That has grown from the comedy club as we now know it. And therefore, anybody who starts a comedy club makes it in the mould of Mock the Week, with the same proportion of women, largely.
I mean, there is a fairly, don't know what the word is really, a fairly good, fairly healthy scene in Leicester now, with 4, 5, maybe 6 kind of independent clubs that pop up. There's Club Smashing, there's Cocktails and Comedy, there's other
all
things.
of them, I guess. They do. Yeah, I mean, the festival's great, but they do all year round. The clubs, they do struggle a bit to get different people in to watch comedy at the smaller clubs, and which is a bit of a shame. But I perform at them a lot, and you find yourself performing to the same audience more or less a lot of the time, which is a shame. It's good in a way for me because I'm writing a lot these days. I'm quite mind's working well in a comedic way, so I get to try out different stuff.
Yeah,
but,
so do you change your material quite a lot?
I do in Leicester, and then but then they use my style, so then I go to Stoke or somewhere and they won't laugh. They don't get it at all. And I think, oh, of course, that isn't really that great.
So is there such, do any of you think there is specific stuff about Leicester that Leicester people find funny, or is that not true?
I have to say, I don't think anything special, genuinely. Okay. I think every provincial city in the land likes it when they talk about us. You know, so a comic will find out what your local toilet is, you know, whether it's, anyone from Broadston, and it's like, you know, and it's talking about us. And so, you know, comics will find the bits about Leicester that are unique to Leicester, be it the wall or whatever, you know, the jewellery wall or, you know, the Premiership or whatever, and we like it because they're talking about us. But the things are going to be different from city to city, but I don't think there's a uniqueness to the psychology of Leicester audiences as such. I don't think, apart from the things that make Leicester unique anyway, like it's, you know, but like its multiculturalism, for example. But I don't think that actually translates a great deal to what I've seen. I've not seen anything more Leicester audiences out as different.
No. I think laughter's pretty universal, really.
I suppose what I was meaning was more about subject matter and material, and of course those local references. Yes, I mean, one thing that people at acts have said to me over the years is that Leicester is a fairly comedy savvy city, and therefore trying out new material, and also working out perhaps Matt, you kind of touched on this a little bit, is what's okay to laugh about and what isn't okay to laugh about. It's an alright city to try some of those things out because the audience are comedy savvy. The
reason that Leicester is above other cities in that way is because of the Leicester Comedy Festival. The fact that we have a month-long festival where you can perform festival comedy, the sort of thing that grew from the Edinburgh Fringe, but Leicester was the first dedicated comedy festival, and everybody who has a comedy festival is actually emulating Leicester. They're not emulating Edinburgh to the same extent. And so you're able to do an act like myself at the Scottish Falsetto Sock Puppet Theatre, and before that I did the show The Sitcom Trials. Those are shows which only work as festival shows. The Socks performing comedy clubs, but they flourish given an hour, and you get the double act, the sketch comedians, the experimental comedians, the musical comedians, all the non-traditional stand-up comedy gets to flourish in a festival atmosphere. Festival atmosphere is something which builds up the understanding that comedy is a thing to go to, that advertises it so that people know that it's on and to feel safe going to it. It's not just dotted around the year, although it spreads beyond the month when it takes place. And I think Leicester, as a result, is one of the places where you will know more people who are au fait with comedy and have seen it live of this ilk.
I don't know. I think there is a difference there between Leicester audiences and Leicester Comedy Festival audiences.
Maybe.
That they're not necessarily. So Leicester Comedy Festival, as you say, it's much more fringy in that you know you can put random finger in the brochure, you won't know what it's going to be. I don't know if that necessarily translates an awful lot to the sort of club level of things. I'm thinking of sort of Just the Tonic Jongleurs sort of level for all the stag and hen nights there. I think that that's going to be pretty generic. But yeah, Leicester's comedy festival, certainly that.
But in
they're very
sense,
sort of open, very sort of forgiving audience for saying how much comedy they see in February. Do you know what I mean? They don't seem particularly burned out by the end of it, which always impresses me, I have to say.
Some of us are quite
Not the Some of the rest of us, on the other hand, is entirely different.
But in a sense, Just the Tonic and Jongleurs are the exception to the festival comedy, because they're the clubs that will be full of people, whether it's February or not.
Yeah, they're full of people who don't like comedy necessarily. They're there because it's a work night out or a stag or a hen night or a thing like that. Whereas Leicester Comedy Festival audiences like comedy, and I think if you like comedy a lot and you see comedy a lot, there has to be a time where you get bored of the format. Where you get bored of the comedy club format or the staple of jokes that work on Mock of the Week, and certainly. Doing a circuit for 5 years in a very filthy double act, you're aware that a lot of the stuff you'd see on the surface, it's really dirty, and actually it's really safe. It is brain candy when all's said and done. And that, I think, is pretty. The nice thing about the comedy festival is you get a lot of stuff that's not that. But again, I'm not convinced as to how that translates the rest of the year round.
Yeah, because I would say, I remember speaking to some people after I'd done a show, and they'd travelled to Leicester, so they'd come for the comedy festival, and they'd flown in from Ireland. So, I think that there's one thing that's brilliant about the comedy festival, that actually, the word is out there that people do come to Leicester for that. I think that makes Leicester pretty special, don't you?
I'm not the one to judge.
Well, I do. I'm just going to put that.
I think that means
I do find that, and we were actually just comparing. I've got the Leicester Comedy Festival programme at the same time as I got the Glasgow Comedy Festival. Now, Glasgow is, spoiler alert, bigger than Leicester. Its festival programme is a fraction of the size. I do the same number of nights. I thought the same number of people would play the same amount of time, but it seems not. It seems that Glasgow has yet to catch up with Leicester as far as its comedy festival is concerned. Surprisingly so.
But certainly during the festival, this conversation doesn't necessarily need to be all about the festival, but it sounds to me like what you're suggesting is it is a space to experiment. Yeah. And certainly, Elaine, you've kind of indicated that that's what you've done. You've tried some stuff out during the festival, which might not necessarily be stand-up, but yet people still go and still support what you do, whether those audiences are local or national or international. Yeah. Within the festival, that's what you've found to be the case in terms of being a safe space to experiment.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So if I'm going to do a news show, I often launch it at the festival as a sort of first time out, and so far so good. It's stood me in good stead, and most shows that I've done, I've gone on to tour around the country. But yeah.
And Matt, at the moment, you're focusing on writing an hour long live show, or are you focusing on writing radio, film, whatever, or is it comedy sets? You're
just
looking at?
stand up at the moment. I'm thinking about. I've got some ideas of other stuff to do, but I've not started on anything yet within comedy. But yeah, I did my hour on Thursday, so which was a roaring success. So if you didn't see that, hopefully I'll do it in Leicester again at some point. But yeah, so that was a lot of stuff I've written over the last 6 months, really, and mostly around a theme. So, yeah.
But not Leicester specific.
Yeah, LE8 State of Mind, it was called. So Blavey, Countersthorpe, stuff to do with that. It wasn't all around that. I want to write a bit more about that, so it's fully, or just about fully within that theme. Yeah, and yeah, I'll definitely do that again at some point.
Yeah. Okay. And Elaine, you're not performing in this year's festival.
No.
Sort of properly, although you have done a few bits and
I've done
pieces.
some bits and bobs, yeah, with kids. Well, not with kids, but just to say.
4 kids.
4 children.
And Kev, you're on in the festival this year?
Scottish Falsetto Sock Puppet Theatre will be doing 2 nights this year at the festival, and we have done Leicester-themed parts of the show. The entire history of Leicester in 5 minutes has featured in the show before now, and Richard III features in this year's show. But no, that's just pandering and name dropping rather than actually being dedicated in any way to Leicester.
And Rob, you're not.
Well, I'm the opposite to Elaine in a way, in that I don't use Leicester to try something new. I will do it to an audience full of invited mates in a pub, but I won't bring a show to Leicester until it's toured around a bit.
Why is that then?
Partly because I don't want to dump on my own doorstep too badly, and you are very aware. It's all right when you're new and everyone likes everything you're doing, and then it reaches the point everything you do is being judged. And also, I'll tend to go to some small town in the Canadian prairies for a week and do a fringe festival that no one knows about, and they will take one for the team and be grateful for it. I will come back to Leicester a rock star, and that's how it works for me. Yeah, and then quite a quiet one for me this year. I'm just I've got 3 shows. I'm writing a lot, albeit very slowly because I'm physically injured at the moment. But I've got 3 shows that I'm drafting, none of which will be ready too soon. But the nice thing, I think, for me in the festival, and it's the 9th year in, and me and Matt did it last night, Bright Sparks Comedy Asylum, which for me, it's a bunch of mental health service users labelled as being, quote-unquote, on the severe and enduring end of the mental health spectrum. And every year they do a comedy show. Every year it always does really well ticket-wise. And I love it to bits. It's for me, it's one of the most satirical things you'll ever see. So by the time you've seen the Peter Soulsby mastermind sketch, whereas congratulations, Pete, you've got 36 passes, you've won a pay rise of £100,000. It's like, there's not many people actually on the conventional clubs that are saying stuff like that. Or after all those suicides at the local mental health unit, spate of suicides, and it was. And they took the toilet doors off the unit because they didn't want people killing themselves in toilets. So completely missing the point that that's not particularly conducive for your mental health. People haven't seen having a dump. And Bright Sparks did this lovely sketch where it's 2 hospital managers banning everything that could kill you, including biros, dignity, self-esteem, paper clips, and then they do a police song. Every little thing's potentially tragic, but that actually has something to say. And the comedy festival gives a home to that. And that was last night, so that's my festival experience for this year, really. I wonder, and I think I'm doing with kids on Monday.
It all ran very smoothly last night, didn't it, Rob?
It was the good ship Flap was sailing through calm waters, Matthew, yes.
Great. Well, thank you very much for coming. We just wanted to sort of have an overview, I suppose, of how live comedy in the city's developed over the last however many years it is. I think I'm right in saying that everybody on the panel today is going to be interviewed in more detail individually about the history of comedy in Leicester. But Rob, Kev, Elaine and Matt, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Thank you.